Enough is enough. It's time we bring this game back ASAP.
Why in 2023, 2024, why is there no repeat of the Street franchise in video games?
It sucks, doesn't it?
Like, why does EA not bring this game back for us? Like, I'll admit, I'd throw my money at this. I don't spend it on Madden, but I would definitely buy this again.
This video game of all time.
NFL Street football games too. Those are elite.
As long as it's the same gameplay as before, just updated rosters, I would still play this. This was such a great game.
Yes, NFL Street top tier. I wish they'd bring it back.
Oh, that guy's probably the best football game in the past 10 years.
It's not just nostalgia, if it still matters. A perfectly unattributed quote that still describes NFL Street. The series still resonates in the hearts and minds of football players, gamers, and fans alike. And I don't think it's just because of our fond memories. While the game still harkens back to a simpler time in gaming, the game still strikes a cultural chord that I don't think we can shake. You see it in the commentary on the game and social channels from the masses, and you even see it from professional voices like NFL teams and news outlets. The series' bombastic swagger created an aesthetic that still resonates with the people today. It showed football being played in settings and formats that American kids would have experienced in their own football playing days. So even though it had fantastical moments and over-the-top gameplay, it still was an authentic reflection of backyard football culture. So why then has the series been non-existent for nearly 2 decades? If the game still has gas left in the tank, how could it ever possibly return? Well, today, I hope to answer some of those questions. My name is Christian Cordova. I've been playing sports games my entire life. I've spent a few years in the industry. So let's dive into these questions together. Before I begin, I should note, any part of NFL Street's story cannot be told without acknowledging the pioneering work of SSX and NBA Street, in particular, NBA Street Volume 2. Both titles were seminal entries in the EA Sports big label that launched before NFL Street and outlined the creative template that other sports could use to adapt their simulation gameplay into a novel arcade experience. I highly recommend checking out the Ringers video on NBA Street Volume 2 and the Gamers video on SSX. I hope to produce a similar video in the future detailing the history of NFL Street's creative vision and execution, but today's video won't focus on those as much. Instead, first, we'll look into the reasons why I think NFL Street was and continues to be great. Then, we'll look at the reasons that led to and continues NFL Street's dormancy. And then lastly, I'll examine what ways I think the series can return. So to kick off, let's take a look back at why NFL Street was such a revelation. First, let's talk about accessibility in a broad sense. NFL Street is easy to pick up and play, but has depth if you want to maximize your flash. In contrast, simulation sports mechanics have grown increasingly complex with decades of annual iterations to its core mechanics. Sure, a necessity to keep their core player base engaged, but over time making the first-time user experience difficult to streamline. Compound this side effect with the expectation to mimic real-life complexity, and simulation sports risks alienating new and casual fans. Contrastly, the arcade nature of NFL Street helps unencumber its gameplay formula, so it could boil down the essential elements of NFL football in a way that a wider audience could enjoy. Notably, the game design streamlines the amount of information the player has to make decisions off of, from pre-game to pre-snap to post-snap. With its 7-on-7 format, condensed playbook, and limited number of player attributes, it's inherently easier for a player to size up the chess pieces on the board and understand how they can move. But what makes NFL Street different from other arcade adaptations of football is the added gameplay depth through its risk-reward systems, namely its restraint on personnel and the style points and game breaker system. First, the 7-man team playing both sides of the ball forced the player to more directly manage personnel trade-offs. As a kid, I didn't understand the pros and cons of running 11 personnel versus 21 personnel, or what the difference was between nickel, dime, and dollar defenses. But damn if I didn't know that having to settle for Peyton Manning as my free safety was going to put some risk on my ability to stop the opposing offense. But this restraint causes the player to pay closer attention to player attributes than you probably would in any other arcade football game. I know it makes me consider what kind of QB I want to run on my team. Should I have a QB with better throwing attributes but has stones for feet? Or should I get more of a scrambling quarterback that can at least pursue the ball carrier on defense? It's a personnel decision-making process that doesn't really exist in the NFL, but more so does on the playground. Second, and most importantly, the game breaker. Will almost guarantee its user a change of possession or automatic score, a crucial card to play in the race to the end of the game, which can only be accessed by playing the game in style. However, these showboating moves can often result in turnovers if not timed correctly. As emphasized in other EA Sports big titles, style points go beyond aesthetic. They can directly influence the scoreboard. Unlike traditional football, in NFL Street, it's not enough to get the ball from point A to point B. Now, while I was growing up playing sports, my father and coaches would insist that our play style should focus on strong fundamentals and not flash. But in NFL Street, playing the game with flash is fundamental and the most efficient way to securing a dub. So not only does the style system feel like a fun and expressive way to stunt on your opponent, but it's strategic as well. Not to mention, the choice on when to unleash your game breaker, whether to gamble and wait for a game breaker 2, or seeing if you can overcome a defensive game breaker, are all risk-reward choices that add a layer of complexity to the series that I can't find in other arcade football games. And because football is such a possession-scarce sport, the game breaker mechanic in NFL Street felt more consequential than, say, NBA Street, leading it to more strategic utility. All this to say that while the arcade game design simplifies the experience on the front end, its hyperbolic adaptation of football provides depth on the back end. In this way, NFL Street demonstrates how arcade football should be done. It is possible to have a football game be easy to pick up and play, but have moment-to-moment gameplay deep enough to warrant existing apart from its simulation counterpart. It won't ever be as deep mechanically as simulation, but that doesn't mean it can't have the same longevity. Now, the most subversive part about NFL Street's design is that, despite there objectively being less variables than simulation football, its football outcomes seem even less predictable. A large part of this is because the game encourages and incentivizes improvisational football. Not only does this help make the game more accessible by rewarding risk-taking instead of punishing it, but it also leads to the second thing that I think makes NFL Street so special, and that is its unscripted gameplay. There's something so uniquely chaotic about NFL Street's gameplay. It's not just the camera shakes or the over-the-top animations, though I do love those. The chaos comes from each play feeling like it could play out in a unique way. The risk-reward system with style moves, lateraling the ball, stringing together broken tackles and ball carrier moves, or running up a wall. The outcome of a play feels unscripted in a way. It feels player-driven and novel. The polished animation and physics system combined with the ball carrier design gives the player so many choices on how to get from point A to point B with the ball in a fun and creative way. It's not that this unscripted gameplay feel is entirely missing in modern sports sim, but few capture that feeling so consistently throughout a playthrough, and I think it's because NFL Street goes out of its way to design its football to be played improvisationally. This is a special characteristic of NFL Street and a key reason why I think it's still relevant. But I've talked a lot about gameplay and game design, but likely the most important driver of NFL Street's cultural relevance is its aesthetic or art design. The alternative art direction of this NFL game is in the name, NFL Street. The presentation and the world it represents is wholly different than the sleek NFL broadcast style common in simulation football. Now, SSX initiated EA Sports big titles to take on a more extreme and less corporate broadcast aesthetic, and subsequently, NBA Street skillfully adapted that style for a licensed sports product. So by the time NFL Street started development, I imagine a good portion of the art directions framework was already established. That alternative street aesthetic was present in the player's attire, the in-game environments, the soundtrack, the over-the-top animation, and the loading screen art, and even the sound effects of the menu. All these details cultivated this alternate NFL world that had soul. But where NFL Street really innovated and did uniquely was that personality it endowed its players with.
I done it again.
Compared to simulation titles at the time and even today, the players on this field felt more human. Instead of feeling like robotic versions of your favorite football player, they oddly felt alive, and this was because, I think, of two reasons. We can see their faces, and we can hear their voices.
This way, baby, this way.
On the first reason, obviously, an NFL football game without helmets is impermissible these days, but that creative decision allowed for a level of expression from the players that we had not yet seen from simulation titles. In simulation football, the players' faces are either hidden or buried underneath a helmet, while in NFL Street, they are front and center. We have cutscenes at the start, during, and after the game, and we see the players dance, smile, gesture, raise their eyebrows, and grit their teeth. We had never seen NFL players represented with this level of detailed expression, and I don't think we've seen it since. Second, we hear their voices. Unlike simulation football and even NBA Street Volume 2, there were no announcers in NFL Street. You had background music that worked most of the time, but really what filled up the moments of silence were the players themselves. They talked smack, barked out orders to teammates, and celebrated their positive plays. We had moments of humor with,
Man, they're not that good.
You're not that good.
That's your man right there. That's my man. The big fat dude, yeah. I don't think so. Don't get scared. You can handle him. You stick him. Just stick him. It's going to be a long day.
Even though the voice lines and cutscenes could get repetitive and occasionally ventured into Uncanny Valley, NFL Street emphasized these humanizing elements to the game's audiovisual forefront. These aspects of the in-game player coalesces into personality, exuding a bombast and exuberance most people experience when playing their own backyard football. If NBA Street Volume 2 authentically reflected the culture of basketball, NFL Street authentically reflected the humanity of football. Now combine all of that with the aforementioned aesthetic elements, the gameplay and game design, and you end up with a football game that may not be realistic, but feels real. It takes the superheroes of the NFL and brings them into a less polished world that is infinitely more familiar to the average American without subduing power fantasy. This threading of the needle is a large reason why this series still matters to NFL fans and players. So then, why does it no longer exist? Commercially, at least. If this game is so spectacular, why hasn't EA or some other publisher tried to make a spiritual successor? Well, first, let's recognize the obvious point, that the NFL and the NFLPA could never license such a brazen form of football with the unprotected violence of NFL Street. So when we refer to its spiritual successor, we mean it more in abstraction. It's provided experience and appeal. So, setting that factor aside, we'll have to examine the commercial challenges that both NFL Street and its genre face. First, we can examine why the series never made it past the 6th generation of consoles. We can do that by looking at unit sales. According to VG charts, between the years of 2004 and 2008, NFL Street largely sold 5 to 6 million units. Compare that to the 27 million units of Madden NFL, we could see that it sold about a fifth of the units of its simulation counterpart. Combine into the fact that as we reach the end of that term, we start to walk into the global recession. So the EA leadership team decidedly got more conservative. So by the time NFL Street's real successor, NFL Tour, launched in January 2008, it launched to mostly negative reviews, thus mostly ending the opportunity of the series moving forward. And also, we can realize that even though the game was really fresh upon initial adaptation, NFL Street lacked the commercial and creative justification for numerous sequels, which was the business paradigm and expectations. Now, you could ask, why would a game that's as fresh and out of the box as NFL Street require so many sequels? Well, the game operated in a consumer licensing ecosystem, where the expectation was those annual scaled recurring revenues, such as Madden NFL. So really, it lacked the justification to continue to operate in that ecosystem. Add on to the fact that you have global recession risk, and you could see why EA decided to focus more on just their simulation title. And this wasn't just for NFL Street, this applied to the entire sublabel of EA Sports Big, thus making it really difficult to invest in that arcade genre, and NFL Street as a series. That's my read of it, at least. NFL Street demonstrated some potential upon initial adaptation, but ultimately had to be put on hiatus. But if the series really does have durability, why hasn't someone tried to make a spiritual successor? Well, that requires some nuance. In reality, publishers and studios have tried to revive the football arcade genre, which could have carried the legacy of NFL Street. For example, in 2012, EA rebooted SSX and NFL Blitz, but the series wouldn't continue thereafter. And then we started to move towards the 8th generation of consoles, where we started to see the rise of microtransactions and the game-as-a-service model. Ultimately, what this did was deprioritize the diversification of sports genres. Really, EA Sports and any AAA sports publisher really didn't have any incentive to pull their player out of the existing ecosystem where there was in-game spending. For example, we even see it in their product strategy. On investor calls, you would have analysts asking the management if they would be interested in investing in arcade sports titles to bolster their pipeline. And the management would say that there was a time for that when we had things like NFL Head Coach and NFL Street, but now given the in-game spending of their existing sports sim titles, it just made more sense to keep those things underneath one roof. In other words, why create a smaller amusement park with its own admission price right next to the larger amusement park where there was more spending on concessions, gifts, and fast pass lanes? And then we would actually see this from other sports publishers like NBA 2K, who arguably in 2K14 were able to draw elements from NBA Street with things like the park. And then by being able to diversify their in-game spending revenue streams by really making a clean RPG element experience, it opened up the door for football to start to experiment with this as well. We saw this with the short-lived but very promising feature of the Yard in Madden 21. And post-COVID, we've started to see other publishers and studios try to break into that arcade genre. For example, we had Wild Card Football from Saber Interactive, we had NFL Retro Bowl and Apple Arcade, and NFL Universe and Roblox, just to name a few. And while some of these titles have found success, none of them, in my opinion, have really demonstrated or justified the commercial viability or potential of an NFL Street successor. And even today, we have Madden with the 3v3 Superstar mode, which draws on some of that chaotic element of NFL Street, but it's difficult to replicate that aforementioned appeal of NFL Street within a simulation engine. So if existing publishers have tried to make more arcade football a thing, whether it's a new game mode or a new title, why haven't they been able to find a scaled audience yet? I think it comes down to two things. The first is the attention economy. In other words, people really only want a definitive experience, not a derivative one, and it helps explain why the arcade genre is so dormant. Put another way, you really only have so much time these days to engage your football affinity. Between NFL, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, NFL broadcasts, online sports betting, fantasy football, being interested in a college football team, between playing Madden or playing College Football 25 or playing the sport in real life and all other life's experiences, where's the time to play a off-the-wall, unique arcade football experience where you're not even sure your friends are going to be at when you start playing the game? Now, the second key reason are international markets, or the lack thereof. Compared to American football, both soccer and basketball have scaled and growing international fandoms, which means they have a global and diverse audience with which to service. That means creating arcade games in those sports are inherently less risky because of that large top of funnel. It also means you have access to international development teams who intimately understand the global appeal of those sports, who also happen to be more cost effective. This means that you can find viability for that arcade genre on things like the mobile platforms. This is true for things like baseball, given how popular mobile games and the sport is in Asia, means that there's more viability for that sport. Ultimately, American football does not have the luxury of a global diverse market with which to incubate its arcade genre. So in conclusion, if a spiritual successor to NFL Street has relatively low standalone sales expectations and struggles to manifest into today's market given the reasons we just talked about, how could the series ever possibly return, with exception to mods? So right now, we reviewed two things. One, we know that NFL Street demonstrates some untapped creative potential within the sport of football for video games. But second, we know that potential faces real market and commercial challenges that keep it from being actualized. So if we're at a stalemate, what must be done to bring back something so many of us know can be electric? Ultimately, an NFL Street successor will have to attract a larger audience than its subgenre typically has. And I actually think College Football 25 demonstrated this pretty well, even though it's simulation and not arcade. Back in the Gen 6 and Gen 7 console eras, NCAA, as it was known at the time, likely sold only a fraction of Madden units. But by the time we got to 2024 for College 25's launch, we saw by November 2024, according to public reports, it was the best-selling sports game within the United States for launch in history. That's more than NBA 2K, EAFC, Madden, anyone. A lot of people expected it to sell well. I don't think anyone expected it to sell that well. I certainly didn't. And obviously, a large part of that was because of the pent-up demand for a AAA licensed college football simulation, no doubt. But it's also like that audience for college football is not that much bigger or different than the audience for NFL football. There are some differences, but there's a large overlap there. So I do think a large part of college football's breakout success is that it really delivered a fresh football experience that the market was clamoring for. So when we look forward for what an NFL Street successor will need to do, it doesn't necessarily need to reach the commercial heights of CFB 25. It just needs to deliver on a larger audience than arcade football typically has. And in order for that to happen, they're going to have to check, I think, at least two major boxes. The first one being cultural appeal, and the second one being expanding new audiences. So on this first point of cultural appeal, I think part of what makes sports valuable and important in society is the culture it breathes, right? So it delivers value and it helps to give us a sense of identity in the places where we live. And having a video game reflect that culture is table stakes. It's not enough just to replicate the sports mechanics within a video game in order to be successful. You really have to be able to develop and articulate that culture that is embedded within the sports. And I think College Football 25 really did this well. Now, we talked about how well it sold, but a large part of that, I think, again, is because of the cultural experience that it provided a multitude of Americans, which is one of the reasons why I think it was one of the best-selling games in the United States. And so what that looked like was across representing 134 FBS schools, they did a really good job making all the different pockets of the United States population feeling like they're included in the game. Now, that was true for people like me that went to the University of Texas, getting to see that tradition, getting to see the stadiums, and all the idiosyncratic parts that I experienced going to that school being reflected in the game was such an authentic experience for me. And it was prideful to see that element of my identity and my experience being reflected in a AAA game. And that's true for even the smaller schools that were included in the game as well. An NFL Street successor would have to reflect that American identity and culture as well to penetrate the domestic market, but in a different way, right? You're not going to be able to do it with 134 FBS school licenses, but you're definitely going to have to tap into the things that are resonant within the sport of American football and make sure that that's reflected in the game. Another example we can learn from, which is not football, but the other major American sport, basketball, is NBA 2K, in particular the park feature / the city. You know, I think NBA Street Volume 2 did a really good job having individual expression within the game. That's with the style moves, the game breakers, with that street format. But really what has enabled that idea to grow, I think, is the city within the NBA 2K. There's such a great element of individual expression there. And even though it's with different features, really what that game mode has done is that it created a playground with which you can play basketball, but it's a playground in a world worth being competitive and dominating in. And so by imbuing the park and the city with elements of basketball culture, which could be a whole video on its own, you create a world that, even though it's not the most simulation-like experience within NBA 2K, it becomes a world that players have an incentive to actually grind the game modes, spend virtual currency on their VC attributes so they can be competitive in the game of basketball in that virtual world. I know there are complaints around that model and how it's iterated over the course of a decade, but undoubtedly it's been successful in creating that individual expression for millions of players year after year, not just in America, but globally. So there's an inkling there that I think an NFL Street successor would also have to pull into. It could be a patchwork of all the different elements of football culture, not that are just American, but just things that draw people to that sport being reflected in a digital environment that makes it worth playing, even if it's more of an arcade-like experience. And the last thing I'll touch on this point is that NFL Street, I think, is still culturally relevant on its own, right? I think you see it in a lot of sports media and sports audiences. They're looking for their voices within sports to not be as corporate, or to hopefully be a bit more buttoned down, a la Pat McAfee or John Boy Media. But I don't think that means you could just straight up make NFL Street 4 or something as unhinged as Blitz the League in order to find that larger audience. I think it'll ultimately come down to the second piece that we need to talk about, which is attracting new audiences. In order for an NFL Street successor to be successful, we're going to have to focus on growing, the amount of audiences that this sort of game can appeal to. And to learn from that, there are a couple of games that I want to talk about. The first one being Helldivers 2 by Arrowhead Studios. Now, I know, not a sports game, in fact, a third-person shooter, but there are some really key elements we can learn from this. It became one of the best-selling games in 2024 with a relatively unknown IP in a really crowded genre/audience makeup it was trying to penetrate. And I think it was able to do this with 4 key elements that we can learn from. First, it had a really unique voice. So having that Starship Troopers satire of militarism sort of voice in the game helped it really differentiate from things like Call of Duty. Then I think we actually saw a lot of ingenuity with the actual game mechanics and things that affected the core gameplay loop. Things that really helped make the game social and really added some stickiness to the game. And I really saw that, for me, in the community-driven quest progression system known as the Galactic War Map, jumping from planet to planet and trying to have a meta-narrative that I can kind of roleplay in. I think that was super unique. Thirdly, I think we saw it within the monetization system, a tactic that I think the sports genre can definitely learn from. It was at a sub-premium price point at $40, which is relevant for the arcade sports genre. But it also had in-game monetization with battle passes, but it did it in a way that still built up goodwill with the community base. So learning from those tactics specifically, and we can make a whole video about it, but I think that could be a really interesting lesson for the sports genre as well, given the business requirements and demands that are typically on the sports genre. And then lastly, Helldivers and Arrowhead Studios did a really good job of just making the game really silly and fun and bombastic with making just big things go boom. It was something that was just so infectious and made you want to come back to the game and get larger weapons so you can make bigger explosions. That over-the-top wackiness is really what was differentiated and was appealing about the game, and I think that can apply to, in an abstract way, to arcade sports. And that key element of really differentiating yourself is something that attracts new audiences, is something that arcade sports is going to ultimately have to lean into. And I think we're already starting to see that with the second game I want to talk about, which is Rematch. It's the other football, soccer, made by Slow Clap and Kepler Interactive. At the time of this recording, it's actually launching this week. It's already had a pretty successful beta and early access period. But really the key piece I want to hone in on is that the studio that made this, they have a competency in fluid controls. They're most well known for their fighting game Sifu. And what they've done now is that they're trying to make a soccer game that also appeals to the Rocket League audience and that competitive multiplayer audience. And I think that's interesting because hopefully they'll penetrate both that soccer sim audience of EAFC and eFootball, but then also penetrate that Rocket League audience and bring those two audiences together. I think that's a really interesting formula for making an arcade or just non-simulation sports title sustainable and an ability to thrive commercially. So these guys really have their secret sauce dialed in. Early signs show that they're being rather successful in executing on those ideas. And I think anybody interested in a revival of the sports arcade genre, and in particular an NFL Street successor, will have to follow these guys and see how their game and audience develops to hopefully something we can learn from. And then lastly, I think there's a format within football that we should be learning from and leaning into in order to make a successor to NFL Street a reality. And that is flag football.
Oh, brother, this guy's...
Now I know flag football is not as fantastical or as sexy as traditional football, and maybe struggles to be as fantastical as something like NFL Street. But there are a few key things that I think make a good argument for that format. One is participation domestically within the United States. All up, when you include children and adults, participation in flag football is actually larger than that of traditional football. And it's growing in recent times compared to traditional football, where it's either flat to declining. So there really is a positive tailwind and trend there that I think lends to the sport becoming more popular and more adept at becoming adapted for a video game. Second is that international piece that we've talked about. The lack of an international audience for American football is quite the crutch. It hamstrings the ability to de-risk the audience profiles that an arcade football game can sell into. And so even though flag football is not the largest international sport currently, with the LA Olympics happening in 2008, with flag football being a part of that, and then just seeing the institutions of things like NFL investing in the sport to have it be exported to other countries, I think it's a really key piece that an arcade football game would have to lean into to hopefully grow its audience. And then the last thing that I would want to touch on is just the things that may work against flag football. Obviously, it's not as hard-hitting and as over the top, potentially, as NFL Street on paper. Flag football, almost in its origins, is not as fantastical or provides a power fantasy as traditional football does. But I think with a little imagination and a little bit of creativity, we could still find ways to make flag football creative, fantastical, and over the top that captured some of that magic of NFL Street, but just without maybe the hyper-violent aspect of it. So that's ultimately why I wanted to make this video and create this channel, because there is an ocean out there with waves to be ridden to take the sport of football, namely the NFL product, to imagery, experiences, and thrills beyond the status quo. We know we can go there because NFL Street took us there. Now, we remain at bay mainly because of the things that anchor our attention and investment. You can surmise that maybe the seas are just not fit for sail right now. But one day, the winds will shift, the tides will pull back into the ocean, and hopefully the venture of new arcade football can set sail once more. And when it does, I know what map the captain of that eager ship will turn to first: NFL Street. And hopefully NFL Street will serve as the North Star for a brighter football future. Not just because it's more arcadey or more over the top or different from simulation or just nostalgia bait, but because it was an authentic, fluid, familiar yet fantastical experience that brought the heroes of the NFL and its culture closer to the people that loved its game, down from the stadiums and into the streets, hopefully lighting our way to the future and rejuvenation of the genre. My name is Christian Cordova. I love sports video games. I welcome you guys to this discussion. If you would like to leave a comment down in the comment section below, please, I would love to hear your thoughts. I'll talk to you guys soon, and thank you for watching.